going to try this with the camera on. And then I'll have you let me know. Camera on, camera off, which is easier for you. So Brother Sam is Dead, people. We are chapter 11, page 146. But it's been a few days since we read. So I'm going to flip back the page to 145, kind of look through that page and be like, okay, what's going on in this story? So at the top, we've got Ned's head jumped off his body and popped into the air. Okay. And Ned's head didn't, jump off his body. Some of you in your answers were like, hey, Ned's head jumped off his body. So you literally took it word for word. No, his head, jumped, or it looked like it jumped off his body, because one of the British soldiers, his head. So Ned's gone. Ned's dead. Tim threw up, obviously, because he's seen this all happen. As you scroll back through, as I scan back down, we've got the British carrying things into the house. And then they lit the house on fire. And it says Tim turned and ran down the road toward Dr. Hobart's. So originally he was going to Dr. Hobart's to get the doctor because there was a wounded soldier at the tavern. And last sentence says, I didn't feel much like being a Tory anymore. So early in the chapter, Tim was saying he felt like a Tory because of what the American soldiers did to his father, took his father. But now he's like, yeah, I've seen what the Tory soldiers do, and he's like, I don't feel like a Tory. So page 146, chapter 11. Dr. Hobart saddled up and rode down to the tavern, and I walked back slowly. There wasn't any hurry now. Mostly I tried to put out of my mind what I'd seen. I went on to the barn and cleaned myself up as best I could, and then I went into the tap room. It was full of people who'd come to talk about the British raid. The wounded man was still alive. The ball had hit him high in his ribs and had stuck there without damaging him much. Dr. Hobart gave him a huge mug of rum, and we had drunk that down, and it had had a chance to work. 4 men held the man down flat on a table while Dr. Hobart sliced open the wound and pulled the ball out with his forceps. Okay, so they used the rum as like anesthesia. They got him drunk so he can't feel anything. A couple of broken ribs, he said, but they'll knit. He bound the man tightly, and we propped him up with some comforters in front of the fire and gave him some more rum and something to eat. He was pretty drunk, but he told us his story. They're after the munitions stored in Danbury, he said. I came up here to warn the militia. I thought somebody might stop them, but it was too late. Dr. Hobart shook his head. A wasted errand, he said. The train van is pretty thin here. I know, the wounded man said. We were expecting some Continental troops. You've heard of General Benedict Arnold, I expect. He and General Silliman and some others had been chasing the British up from Campo and Fairfield. They were hoping somebody would slow them down until they could catch up. Oh, I don't know what good it would do. They haven't got the men to take on that bunch of lobsterbacks. I took a deep breath. Sam was with Benedict Arnold's troops. Or at least he had been. Sir, you mean General Arnold's troops are coming through Reading? That was the plan. Of course, you can't ever tell what's going to happen in war. Things change a lot. I knew it was foolish to believe that Sam might be with General Arnold's troops. But when you want something bad enough, you can't stop yourself from hoping. I wondered if Mom remembered that Sam was with Arnold. I didn't think she would. She wouldn't have paid any attention to something like that. I went to the window and looked out. It had clouded over and was beginning to rain. A man was running across the training ground. In a moment, I saw that it was Captain Betts. He came swiftly toward the tavern, opened the door, and came in. Stephen, someone said. You escaped? They let some of us go, he said. How many? 9. They let most of us go. They only kept 3. Is Jerry Sanford all right, sir? He shook his head. They kept him. Don't ask me why they kept a boy. Kept Jerry? What will they do with him, sir? I don't know, he said gruffly. What's happened here? They've gone on north toward Danbury, somebody told him. They burnt Starr's house and killed some people there. Dan Starr? They killed Dan Starr? Yes. Captain Betts looked grim and hard. We can still catch them. Going to get the train band out. We'll follow them through the fields and cut them down from behind the walls. Tim, go over and ring the church bell. Get cracking. I didn't want to get into it, but I had to obey. I started toward the door, but my mother grabbed my collar. No, no, she said, not my boy. You don't involve any more Meekers in this terrible war. Send your own child out to play soldier if you want, Stephen Betts, but no more of mine. Betts stared at Mother. Where's your patriotism, woman? Bah, patriotism. Your patriotism has got my husband in prison, and one of my children out there in the rain and the muck, shooting people, likely to be dead any minute, and my business half ruined. Go sell your patriotism elsewhere. I've had enough of it. They're killing your neighbors, Susanna, Captain Betts shouted. They've killed Dan Starr. And there's enough dead already. Tim, he started. Mother snatched up the poker from the fireplace. Leave my boy alone, Stephen Betts, she said. She raised the poker over her head, and I knew from the mad look in her eye that she would hit Captain Betts if she had to. Mother, he said. The devil on you, Betts said. I can't fool with you any longer. Then he turned and strode out of the tavern, banging the door behind him. A few minutes later, the church bell began to toll the alarm. The people in the tavern began to leave. Some of them, I knew, belonged to the train band and were going off to get their weapons. A lot of the others just smelled trouble and wanted to get clear of it. Pretty soon there were only a couple of men left. The wounded man had fallen asleep by the fire. Outside, the wind had begun to blow the rain against the windows. Night was falling. Mother sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. Timothy, I want to pray. Come here and pray with me. She took my hand and pulled me down on the bench beside her. I put my head down. Oh, Lord, she said, please take this wharf away from here. What have we done to endure this? Why must it go on so long? What have we done in thy sight to deserve this evil? She stopped. There was no answer, and after a moment she raised her eyes, got up, and began to slice some onions into the stew pot for supper. And an hour later, as I was getting hungry and wondering when supper would be ready, we heard distant sounds again, the sounds of marching men and horses trotting and orders being shouted. I looked at Mother. The wounded man by the fire raised his eyes. They're coming back again, he said. Maybe it's the train band. Okay, so in the train band's the American soldiers from Reading who were fighting. But my heart was pounding, and I knew who I hoped it was. I ran out into the yard. It was nearly full dark, and the rain splattered in squalls against my face. I looked down the Fairfield Road. It was hard to make out much, but indistinctly. I could see a body of men coming toward us. I pulled back into the shadow of the house and watched them come up. After a while, I began to make out the shapes of the ones on horseback. I could tell by their hats that they weren't redcoats. I darted back into the tavern. They're Continentals, I said. Thank the Lord, the wounded man said. Mother and I went to the window. The troops marched by, then broke formation and began to spread out through the village, looking for shelter from the rain. A lot of them went into the church or Mr. Heron's barn out behind. Then the tavern door banged open, and 4 or 5 men strode in. Leading them was a general, wearing the long blue Continental coat and cockade hat with feathers in it. He said nothing to us, but dropped down at the table. The aides stood around him. Rum for General Wooster, boy, one of the aides said. Then he looked at Mother. You're the taverner, ma'am? Yes, sir. We'll need some dinner. I want my stew. But I didn't care. General David Wooster was head of the Connecticut militia. I'd never seen a general up close before, and as I brought the rum and water, I looked him over. I was disappointed. He wasn't very glorious looking, just a tired old man who was worried and frowning. As I stared, he yawned and rubbed his eyes. Timothy, Mother snapped, bring the gentlemen their dinners. Suddenly the wounded man began to struggle to his feet and saluted. Who are you? General Wooster said. Private Hodge, sir. I took a British ball this afternoon. They were here, then? Yes, sir. They've gone on toward Danbury about 8 hours ago. General Wooster ran his hand across his eyes. 8 hours, he said softly. He took his hand off his eyes. Sit down, sir, he said. Was there any attempt made to stop them? The wounded man struggled to the floor. No, sir, not that I could see, sir. I stepped forward. Sir, some of the train band fired on them from a house just down the road. The redcoats killed them all and burned Starr's house. I remembered Ned's head jumping off his shoulders. How many men in the house, son? I don't know, sir, maybe 5 or 6. Suddenly, the door banged open again. Another Continental officer stood there, gazing around the room. Then he walked in, followed by his aides, and crossed the room to General Wooster. In a moment, saw the insignia on his shoulder. He was a general, too. He walked over to General Wooster, followed by his aides. General Wooster got up. "Ben," he said, "it's good to see you. Boy, a glass of rum for General Arnold." So General Arnold was in Reading. I brought the rum and water and some bread, and we scraped out the bottom of the stew pot to feed General Arnold and his aides. As they ate, they talked, and I stood back ready to serve and listened. They talked about routes and marching orders and other military things I didn't understand. Twice they mentioned William Heron in a friendly way. I thought that was strange, but I didn't worry about it much, because I couldn't get it out of my mind that right at that moment, Sam might be in Reading somewhere. But what was I going to do about it? Of course, he didn't know that Father was gone, and it worried me that he might be afraid to come home. Then there was the other side of it, which was that the chances were that Sam wasn't in General Arnold's troops anymore. Probably was 100 miles from Reading anyway. I knew I was being foolish, but I couldn't help myself. And after a bit, I said, "Mother, I'd better go out and see to the livestock." "All right," she said, "but don't be long. I may need you to help with the gentleman here." I went through the kitchen, out to the barnyard, and then around to the front. It was full dark, and the rain was spitting against me, soaking my face. Across the road, some troops stood in the church doorway, smoking pipes. I crossed over. A soldier barred my way. "I'm looking for Sam Meeker," I said. "Is he here?" "Who are you?" "I'm his brother," he said. "Better get an order from an officer." My heart jumped. "Is Sam here?" "Better go find an officer," he insisted. Another soldier turned to us. "Don't make such a fuss," he said. "Let him go. This is Tory's country. I don't trust any of them." "Oh, come on. The boy's not lying. Sam's from around here somewhere. I know that." "Go get him yourself, then," the first soldier said. "I don't want any part of it." "Wait here," the other one said. "I'll see if I can find Sam." He went in, leaving the church door open. I could see soldiers sprawled out in the pews and lying in the aisles trying to sleep. Some of them were drinking from canteens or chewing on hard loaves of bread. The ones who wanted to smoke had come to the door, because it wasn't right to smoke in a church. They were a ragged-looking lot of men, their clothing dirty and torn, and most of them not even having proper uniforms. They needed shaves, and their hair was wild and uncombed. I saw the soldier work his way through the crowd, looking around. I saw him bend down and touch somebody. Sam was coming up the aisle toward me. He looked older and raggedy, too, and he hadn't shaved either. He got to the door. For a moment we stared at each other, and then he put his arms around me and hugged me, and I hugged him back. "Timmy," he said. I couldn't say anything. It felt so good to hug him. I began to cry. Then he began to cry, too. We stood there in the church door, hugging each other and crying all over ourselves. After a couple of minutes, we started feeling foolish, crying that way in front of the soldiers, and we stopped hugging. "I wanted to come over to see you," he said, "but I didn't know if you all hated me." "Hated you?" "I thought you might." "Sam, Father's—" "I know," he said. "That's why I thought you might not want to see me. I didn't know what to do." "How did you find out about Father?" I asked. "The commissary officers found out that I know about dealing in cattle. I've been working with them a lot, looking for beef. And I met somebody from Salem who'd heard about what had happened to Father. I think he got it from the Platts." He touched my shoulder. "How's Mother?" "She's not mad at you either. None of us are." "Let's go over," he said. "I haven't been home for 2 years. Who's in the tavern?" "The generals." "Then I'll have to stay in the barn. I'm not supposed to leave my company. Wait, I'll tell somebody where I'm going just in case they want me." He went into the church. In a moment he was back, and we ducked across the road through the rain and around behind the house to the barn. I lit a lantern. "You've changed, Tim." "I'm more of a grown-up now." "I can see that. Has it been hard on you and Mother?" "You even have to work on Sundays," he said. "Sam, what have they done with Father?" He sucked in a mouthful of air. "I don't know. Put him in prison, probably." "But why? He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't a real Tory. He was just against the war." "He was selling beef to the British." "No, he wasn't. He was selling beef to Mr. Bogardus. He didn't care who bought it." "What difference does it make?" "It was getting to the British. comes down to the same thing.